Hello, this is Mrs. Politsky, and these are notes for U.S. Government, Chapter 2, Section 3, the Articles of Confederation. And you're going to need your handout for your guided notes, and as we go along, there may be a few additional things that I may have you jot down as well. All right, one of the things that we discussed the other day in class was that the Articles of Confederation, well, they had a few flaws. And to help you understand that, we need to look at the features. One being the fact that we had a unicameral, a one-house body of the legislative branch. There was no president, so to carry out a law and have it enforced was nearly impossible. When the unicameral was not in session, there was a committee of states that managed the government. The states would take turns to make sure that things were being done on a day-to-day basis. Some other problems, there was no federal court system. Uh, so any kind of dispute had to be settled by the state, but the problem would be if two states wanted to sue one another, there were no courts to accommodate them. And finally, each state had one vote in Congress. This is something that we talked about with our little simulation the other day. You needed a 2/3 majority to bring up legislation, but you had to have a unanimous vote of all the states, and so each state had 13 votes. To get a unanimous vote and to pass any legislation was nearly impossible. So, one of the things that happened that kind of brought about a change was an event called Shays' Rebellion. And Daniel Shay happened to be a former patriot. He was a member of the Revolutionary Army. He was kind of a farmer. He had lived in western Massachusetts. And at some point in time, him and his fellow veterans demonstrated, basically wanting to have some relief for their taxes that they were paying in the state of Massachusetts. And they took up arms. And what kind of started off as a somewhat of a civil protest almost resulted in the first Civil War here in the United States. And there was concern that more of these events could pop up. Hence, we might need to improve our form of government. And it's probably this event that led to having a constitutional convention to help bring about the U.S. Constitution. All right, some of the weaknesses of the Articles. Well, Congress had no power to levy taxes. So, if our government owed money, it was very difficult to pay that off. Congress had no power to regulate trade, particularly trade with our overseas friends. Congress could not force anyone to obey the laws that it passed because we had no executive branch. That's kind of the main duty of a president, is to ensure the enforcement of the laws that are made. Laws needed to be approved by 9 of the 13 states to pass. Amending the articles required the consent of all the states, and the central government had no executive branch. Government had no national court system, and hence, if you had a problem between two states, there was nowhere to resolve that conflict. All right, one of the positive things that comes out of the Articles of Confederation is that the United States was able to add territory. And probably the most famous chunk of land that was added to the United States during our time under the Articles of Confederation was the annexation of the Northwest Territory, which would include today parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. All right, achievements. And we mentioned some of these just a moment ago. Establishing a fair policy to develop Western lands. Forging a peace treaty after the end of the Revolutionary War with Great Britain. And finally, being able to set up the departments for foreign affairs, which today is known as the Department of the State, or State Department. Secretary of War, or the Department of War today, Department of Defense. Marine, and Treasury. All right, problems faced by our nation. Quarreling began over boundaries and tariffs paid to other states. States kind of couldn't decide, where the actual boundaries were for their actual borders, and so you had some disputes between different states. Not to say that this would be resolved when the Constitution comes into play. We had other events that happened in American history. There was a huge dispute in the days prior to the Civil War between Missouri and Iowa over Missouri's northern boundary and Iowa's southern boundary. The government owed huge debts to nations and the soldiers that fought in the Revolutionary War. And this is kind of where Daniel Shea comes in, because some of his men were protesting for compensation. And then finally, the last couple items, the government had no power to raise money from the states. And this economic depression that took place in 1786 left a lot of farmers with debts, hence Shea's rebellion as well. All right, I hope you got everything.